Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating topic: why simply labeling logical fallacies isn't the intellectual checkmate you might think it is. Look, if you've ever been in a debate, whether that's online or in person, you've probably seen someone drop a phrase like ad hominem or straw man and then just kind of strut away as if they've completely won the argument. It's incredibly frustrating, right? Well, today, we're going to see why that exact approach actually limits our ability to find the truth.
You know, it really begs the question, are these fallacy labels actually helpful in a debate? We so often use these labels like magic spells to just instantly shut down our opponents. We treat them as this convenient shortcut to dismiss someone entirely. But what if there's a much more productive, nuanced way to evaluate arguments? What if pointing out a flaw in someone's logic is really just the beginning of the conversation rather than the end of it? Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to start by moving beyond fallacy labels, then explore the rules of formal logic, look at how we play the argument game, understand why context is everything, and finish up with a much better argument framework. All right, Section 1, Beyond the Fallacy Labels. Let's talk about the problem with gotcha debates. So the ultimate trap in these gotcha debates is literally called the fallacy fallacy. This is the automatic assumption that just because someone argues poorly, their conclusion absolutely must be completely wrong. But here's the thing, a bad argument doesn't somehow alter reality. Someone can use totally flawed reasoning to arrive at a conclusion that happens to be 100% true. So throwing out a fallacy name risks throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Moving on to Section 2. The rules of formal logic. We're looking closely at form and soundness. To really see where these rules come from, we have to look at formal logic, which is basically the mathematical structure of language. It's a system designed to establish exactly which premises imply which conclusions. So the absolute crucial point here is distinguishing between these two specific terms, valid and sound. An argument that is perfectly structured is called valid. In a valid argument, if your premises are true, your conclusion absolutely cannot be false. But validity is just about structure, right? Soundness is the holy grail. An argument is sound when it is perfectly structured, so valid, and all of its premises are actually factually true out there in the real world. Now, when logicians look at structure, they're looking for formal breakdowns. A really great example of this is the fallacy of composition. This happens when you infer something about a whole collection based purely on the properties of its individual parts. The structural math here is fundamentally flawed, because what is true of the parts just isn't automatically true of the whole. For instance, look at this argument. Every part of this house is made of Lego. Therefore, the house is made of Lego. Believe it or not, this argument actually commits the fallacy of composition. Why? Well, because you can't normally guarantee that a whole shares the exact property of its parts. Like, if every single brick in a wall is under 30 centimeters long, it certainly doesn't mean the whole wall is under 30 centimeters long. But in this Lego example, the structure is technically invalid, yet it still leads us to a completely true conclusion. After all, stepping barefoot on that house is going to hurt just as much, right? This perfectly shows why formal validity isn't the be-all and end-all. Okay, Section 3, Playing the Argument Game. We are stepping into informal logic. Since real-world debates are so much messier than pure logic, philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein noted that language actually serves different purposes, which he called language games. Think of a real-world debate not as some all-out war to destroy your enemy, but as one of these games. Philosopher Douglas Walton outlined the implicit rules for playing it honestly. You've got to represent both sides fairly, answer reasonable questions, avoid those premature victory declarations, and appeal to reason. Breaking these isn't breaking formal math, it's just acting in bad faith. A perfect example of breaking these informal rules is the no true Scotsman fallacy. Let's say we're having a debate, and I make the claim that philosophers make great romantic partners. Then you counter that by pointing out a bunch of famous philosophers who were historically terrible lovers. If I immediately reply, well, no true philosopher would be a bad lover, I've just dishonestly changed my definition on the fly. I'm not breaking formal logic. Logic doesn't dictate definitions, but I am totally breaking the informal rules of honest debate by shifting my goalposts just to avoid being wrong. And this brings us to another fascinating rule break, the Mott and Bailey fallacy. This is where an arguer dishonestly shifts between two distinct positions. Imagine I'm leading an extreme political party, and my true extreme claim, the Bailey, is that we must eradicate all puppies. Obviously insane, right? Well, when someone rightfully challenges that insane claim, I retreat to my safe, modest claim, the Mott, and say, look, I'm just saying some puppies might bite when they grow up, don't you agree? I'm deliberately hiding behind a defensible claim to protect an extreme one. Again, it's perfectly legal in formal logic, but it's entirely dishonest in the argument game.
Section 4, Why Context is Everything. Welcome to the gray area. Take the appeal to pity. Usually, begging for sympathy is considered a classic logical fallacy. But context changes everything. If a lawyer is defending a man who stole bread out of sheer, absolute starvation, an appeal to pity actually makes total sense. The context is entirely relevant. But for a premeditated triple homicide, the pity is entirely unwarranted and it immediately becomes a fallacy. Context dictates the validity. Context also heavily dictates who actually bears the burden of proof. If I make a wildly unusual positive claim, like, say, goblins control the weather, the burden is absolutely on me to prove that. I can't just cross my arms and say, well, you prove they don't. But if I'm defending a universally accepted reality like heliocentrism and you deny it, the burden of proof shifts directly to you. You're the one challenging the accepted consensus, so you have to bring the evidence.
Which brings us to Section 5, a better argument framework. Let's look at the solution. The answer requires a pretty major shift in mindset. Instead of playing the gotcha game, we must practice something called epistemic humility. We need to actively ask ourselves, what is the justified warrant of the fallacious argument? In other words, even if my opponent is expressing themselves terribly or using flawed logic, what useful, valid information is still hiding inside their messy delivery? We want to steelman their position, which means building up the absolute strongest possible version of their argument so we can actually engage with the real truth of the matter.
To completely replace the old fallacy name-calling game, we can use a really practical 7-question framework to evaluate any argument. Step 1, is the argument structurally valid? 2, are there obviously false or unsound premises? And 3, step back and really look at their behavior. Are they genuinely having an honest discussion, or are they breaking the informal rules, like we talked about earlier with shifting definitions? Moving on, steps 4 and 5 force us to look closely at confidence. Number 4 asks, with what strength is the conclusion actually being argued? Are they saying this is absolute undeniable proof, high probability, or just a plausible theory? Number 5 is critical. Does the strength of their premises actually match that intention, or did they overplay their hand? For example, putting out a potential slippery slope is totally fine if you're arguing it's a possibility, but it becomes fallacious if you insist it's an absolute guarantee without nearly enough evidence.
Finally, we hit steps 6 and 7, and these require us to actually adapt our own beliefs. Step 6, what have their premises actually shown to be true, regardless of what they intended to prove? And step 7, which is my absolute favorite, under what specific circumstances would your opponent's argument actually be correct? Honestly, this single question forces your brain completely out of attack mode and into a genuine search for reality. It keeps your own beliefs from becoming dogmatic. So the next time you find yourself deep in a heated debate, or you're reading a highly controversial article, I want you to ask yourself this final question. Will you continue searching for fallacies just to dismiss others and win cheap debate points? Or will you embrace epistemic humility, look right past the messy delivery, and find the actual truth hidden in their arguments? Ultimately, the choice is between simply winning a game or genuinely expanding your understanding of the world. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the right questions.